An overview of the anatomy of the GI tract shows us two groups of structures, those found along the alimentary canal or GI tract, and those found as accessory organs. If we follow the GI tract, the first organ encounter is the oral cavity. From the oral cavity, food will be moved onto the oropharynx, the laryngopharynx, and then finally into the esophagus. The esophagus will bring food to the stomach. The chyme will be brought in to the small intestine, duodenum, jejunum, and ileum. From the ileum, food will be moved onto the first part of the large intestine, which is the cecum. From there, it will be moved into the ascending colon, through the hepatic flexure, transverse colon, splenic flexure, descending colon, sigmoid colon, rectum, and finally the anus. Accessory organs are organs that provide secretions that help in the process of digestion. These organs are the salivary glands, parotid, sublingual, submandibular glands, the liver, which makes bile, gallbladder, which modifies and concentrates and delivers bile, pancreas, which makes hormones that regulate blood sugar, and digestive enzymes. What follows is a list of the essential activities or functions of the digestive system. The taking in of food is called ingestion. What follows ingestion is mastication, which is chewing of the food. Chewing of food is part of physical digestion. Next, the food is moved onto the gastrointestinal or GI tract by mechanisms such as propulsion, which means the movement of food, deglutition, which means swallowing, peristalsis, which is the mass movement followed by smooth muscle contractions in the GI tract. Mixing or churning is accomplished by segmentation and is a part of physical digestion. Secretion of enzymes, water, buffer is another essential activity of the digestive system. Digestion, which is the breakdown of food by chemical and mechanical means. Note that mastication is part of physical digestion, as is the churning of food or segmentation. Absorption has to do with moving the broken down nutrients into the bloodstream. Finally, defecation means getting rid of the unused products. A stimulation of the muscles of the GI tract, the smooth muscles of the GI tract, the muscularis mucosa and the muscularis externa will produce contractions. Contractions of the muscularis externa can come into two forms. Peristaltic contractions are going to provide the movement that is going to move the contents of the GI tract along. Another type of movement is called segmentation. Segmentation produces mixing or churning of the contents. The oral cavity is the first part of the alimentary canal or GI tract. Functions of the oral cavity involve ingestion of food, mastication or chewing of food, mechanical digestion of food through mastication, chemical digestion of food via the action of salivary amylases, and deglutition or swallowing. Teeth within the oral cavity assist in the processes of physical digestion and mastication. The number of teeth in a mouth are represented by the dental formula. The dental formula is the number of teeth in one half of the mouth. One half of the mouth would consist of 2 incisors, 1 canine, 2 premolars, 3 molars, multiplied by 2. Salivary glands are accessory organs of the digestive system. There are 3 main salivary glands: the sublingual, submandibular, and the largest, which is the parotid gland. The functions of saliva include the cleansing of the mouth, moistening and dissolving the food, and aiding in the formation of the bolus of food which will be swallowed. Saliva is mostly made of water. It is a slightly acidic solution which also contains electrolytes, salivary amylase, which is involved in the digestion of carbohydrates, mucins, which is the product that makes the saliva sticky, and then some antibacterial or immune system components like lysozyme, immunoglobulin A, which is antibody, IgA, and defensins. The process of deglutition can be explained in 3 phases. The voluntary phase takes place when food is in the oral cavity and is worked on by the tongue and the palate and the actions of saliva. The tongue pushes the bolus of food against the hard palate. This action moves the food into the pharyngeal phase. As the food is moved into the pharynx, the uvula will close, preventing the food from diverting into the nasal cavity. The pharynx is elevated and the pharyngeal constrictor muscles will begin to move the food from the pharynx onto the esophagus. So during the pharyngeal phase, the uvula has closed the passage into the nasal cavity, and the epiglottis will also close, preventing passage of food, of the bolus of food, onto the respiratory conduits. Pharyngeal constrictor muscles are going to move the bolus of food towards the esophagus. At the end of the pharyngeal phase, the bolus of food opens the upper esophageal sphincter, moving the bolus of food into the esophagus. In the esophageal phase, the bolus of food is moved through the esophagus by peristaltic contractions until it arrives at the lower gastroesophageal sphincter. The gastroesophageal sphincter will open and allow the bolus of food into the stomach. During the pharyngeal phase of swallowing, the bolus of food arrives at the upper esophageal sphincter. The upper esophageal sphincter opens and the bolus of food is moved into the esophagus. The esophagus is a tube that will carry food from the pharynx onto the stomach. The tube is lined with non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelial tissue, and it's located posterior to the trachea. The esophagus crosses the thoracic cavity, goes through the diaphragm, and joins at the stomach. The lower esophageal sphincter or lower gastroesophageal sphincter will open as the bolus of food arrives at the end of the esophagus, and the bolus of food will be moved into the stomach. Digestive system histology is consistent throughout the most of the GI tract. If we look from the lumen of the GI tract, to the deeper tissues, we'll find that the GI tract has the same structures throughout most of its length, and we can divide its histological structures into 3 layers. The mucosa layer is the most superficial layer, which includes the lining of the lumen. The submucosa layer is below the mucosa. Muscularis externa layer is the layer of muscle, and the deepest layer is the serosa layer. So the histology of the GI tract consists of 4 layers: the superficial mucosa, underneath it the submucosa, a wall of muscle called the muscularis externa, and a covering of connective tissue called the serosa or serous membrane. Now we can take each of these 4 layers and look at their components. So if we start with the mucosa layer, which is the most superficial layer, we find that the lining of the lumen of the GI tract is made of epithelium. For most of the GI tract, the epithelium that we're going to find is simple columnar epithelium. Below the simple columnar epithelium that lines most of the GI tract, we have a thin layer of connective tissue, areolar connective tissue, called the lamina propria. Finally, below the lamina propria is a thin layer of muscle, called the muscularis mucosa. This smooth muscle contracts, causing localized movements of the GI tract. Most of the mucosal epithelium of the GI tract consists of the same type of tissue: simple, columnar, epithelial tissue. However, there are 2 exceptions. In the esophagus and in the rectum, which is the last part of the large intestine, these areas are subject to mechanical abrasion. Therefore, the tissue is a protective epithelial tissue, non-keratinized, stratified, squamous epithelial tissue. This slide on the right-hand side is showing you the dramatic change of tissue from the esophagus to the stomach. Notice that in the esophageal portion, the tissue is thick, stratified, non-keratinized, stratified squamous epithelial tissue, which protects the lining of the esophagus from mechanical abrasion as the food travels from the pharynx onto the esophagus. Notice how the tissue changes once we arrive at the stomach, becoming a thin, simple columnar tissue. The next layer of tissue in the GI tract is the submucosa. The submucosa is connective tissue, and it has 2 distinct features. There are submucosal glands which secrete mucus or buffer products. And more importantly, there is a submucosal plexus, which consists of a network of nerves that are going to innervate the glands and the submucosa. The submucosal plexus, it starts in the small intestine, which means it is absent in the esophagus and the stomach. The submucosal plexus activates submucosal glands, causing secretions of the products of these glands. The third tissue layer of the GI tract, below the submucosal layer, is called the muscularis layer, also called the muscularis externa, to distinguish it from the muscularis mucosa found as part of the mucosa layer. The muscularis externa consists of the walls of the GI tract, thick layers of smooth muscle. Most of the GI tract will have two muscle layers running at 90-degree angles from each other, a circular layer and a longitudinal layer. So this is the circular layer, and this is longitudinal layer. In the stomach, there is a third layer called the oblique layer. Contractions of these muscles is due to the actions of a nerve plexus found as part of the muscularis externa. The nerve plexus is called the myenteric plexus. The myenteric plexus innervates these thick muscle layers, causing peristalsis and segmentation of the GI tract. The deepest layer of tissue in the GI tract is the serosa layer. The serosa consists of the visceral peritoneum. This is the layer of serous membrane that covers most organs of the GI tract. The exception, the esophagus, which lies mostly in the thoracic cavity, does not have a serosa. Instead, it has a more diffuse connective tissue layer called adventitia. The visceral serosa acts as a passageway for blood vessels and nerves. This model represents the histological layers of the GI tract, specifically those of the small intestine. You can see that the mucosa layer is depicted with the simple columnar epithelium lining the GI tract and the goblet cells as mucus-secreting cells found among the simple columnar epithelial cells. Also notice that the mucosa is folded, creating villi, which increases the surface area of the organ. Below the epithelial lining, there is a small layer of connective tissue called the lamina propria and a very thin layer of muscle called the muscularis mucosa, which produces local movements. Notice that the mucosa of the GI tract at certain places is going to fold inward into the lamina propria, creating glands or crypts. The cells within those glands or crypts have a specific purposes. So glands, intestinal glands or crypts are folds of the lumen, of the lining of the lumen. So these are going to be simple columnar epithelial cells which fold inward towards the lamina propria, creating these glands or crypt structures. This side view of the model shows us the thick submucosal layer, which is connective tissue. It also shows you the submucosal plexus, which innervates submucosal glands in the area. The muscularis externa, seen here, is the thick layer of two layers of smooth muscle found in the GI tract. This constitutes the walls of the organs. Notice that the myenteric plexus, sandwiched between the two layers, innervates these muscles, causing segmentation and peristalsis. Notice the exceptions. The stomach has 3 layers, so it has an extra layer called the oblique layer. The esophagus has the first upper 1/3 of these muscles are actually a skeletal muscle, and the lower 2/3 will be a smooth muscle. Notice the actions of the 2 nerve plexuses found in the GI tract. The submucosal plexus, found in the submucosal layer, stimulates glands, causing secretions of the products of these glands. The submucosal plexus also stimulates the muscularis mucosa, which results in localized movement and contractions. Also remember that the submucosal plexus starts at the small intestines. The esophagus and stomach lack a submucosal plexus. The myenteric plexus, on the other hand, is going to innervate the large, smooth muscle layers in the muscularis externa part of the GI tract, and it will cause the strong contractions responsible for peristalsis and segmentation. The deepest layer, the one that covers the outside of most of the GI tract organs, is the serosa, which actually constitutes the visceral peritoneum, which covers most GI tract organs. The exceptions will be the retroperitoneal organs. The esophagus, which lies mostly in the thoracic cavity, does not have a visceral peritoneum. Instead, it is covered by a loose connective tissue layer called the fibrous adventitia.